All right, looks like we are live. Would I be able to test the audio just to make sure that it's coming through on the live stream?
Sure, Haley.
Check
one.
All right, thanks. Would I be able to test the audio just to make sure that it's coming through on the live stream?
Sure, Haley.
All right, everything is coming in loud and clear. Thanks. Would I be able to test the audio just to make sure that it's coming through on the live stream? All right, everything is coming in loud and clear. All right, everything is coming in loud and clear.
Good morning. My clock shows 11, but we're gonna wait just a few more minutes and let folks have a chance to kind of log in through the technology. So we will get started no later than 11:05. Thank you. All right, good morning. It's 11:03. It looks like our queue is clear, and we are so grateful for all of you taking the time to join us today to talk about Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Feasibility Study. My name is Jennifer DeBrule. I'm the Chief of Public Transportation at DRPT. I am joined this morning by Tim Roseboom, who is our project manager for this study with DRPT, Todd Horsley, who manages our Northern Virginia Transit Office, and our fantastic consultant team of Tom Harrington from Cambridge Systematics and Sue Knapp from KFH. They've done a great job supporting us in this effort. Before we get started, I just ask that if everybody would mind, if you don't mind, keep your mics muted unless you're speaking. It'll help with the background noise. Also wanted to remind everybody that we are live streaming on DRPT's YouTube page. So as we get going, again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're going to keep this to an hour. We do have a pretty detailed presentation to share, but feel free to ask questions, and then we will have time at the end also for questions and discussion. And with that, I think, Tom, we're ready to jump into the slides. So today, in terms of agenda and updates, we're going to update you on our outreach efforts. We're going to give you a summary of the evaluation results from our technical analysis. We're going to talk through some different sensitivity tests that we've done. I mean, obviously, right now it's a challenging time to do long-range transportation planning. So we've done some analysis I think you'll find interesting there. We're going to give you share some of the findings of our land use assessment and also the next steps for the study and how we bring it to completion. Next slide, thanks. Always want to start off with reminding everybody where we're headed and what our charge was from the legislature. The intent of the study is to conduct or to complete a comprehensive and objective evaluation of a range of potential future high-capacity transit alternatives in this corridor between Springfield and Quantico, looking at the costs, the benefits, and the impacts of each option to really inform future decision-making around investment in transit in the corridor. Just want to do a quick refresher on our technical approach. This study is a little different than our normal traditional transit study. On the right-hand side, you'll see that we do that technical analysis and look at transit alternatives and modeling using our regional models and existing comprehensive plans like we normally do. This study is a little unique in that we also have a parallel effort going on looking at the possibility of some different land use scenarios and how those different land use scenarios would then impact potential transit alternatives. So definitely helps inform the decision-making process as these potential projects are considered. Next slide. In terms of schedule, again, refresher, you've seen this slide before. We are at the very point of that red arrow, wrapping up our alternatives development and evaluation, wrapping up our public input, and we are on track to get our final report to the General Assembly by December 1st. Next slide. Next, we're gonna start off the briefing by talking about our public and stakeholder outreach. We have completed two public meetings already. We had one public meeting back in May. We briefed you on that one. That public meeting in June. We held another public meeting in July. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we have our final round of public meetings scheduled for next week. And while we had very much hoped that those were going to be in-person meetings, one in Fairfax and one in Prince William, after a lot of thought and analysis, and out of consideration for public health and the protection of ourselves and our families, those of us that have small children, we've just decided the best thing for all at this point is to move those meetings to be virtual meetings. We are very grateful that we're supported by the team at KFH and Cambridge and PRR, and they have made these first two virtual meetings very successful for us, and so we fully expect to have very engaging and dynamic virtual public meetings next week. So next slide, Tom. So let's talk a little bit about July 7th. The July 7th public meeting, we weren't at a point in the study where we had, a lot of findings, and, we were still early in the analysis, but we felt like it was important because there was going to be such a gap between May and September to have another touch point and have the opportunity for some more public involvement before we got too far into the study. We did have over 80 individuals registered to participate. That doesn't include the staff from our agency or the consultant team. We had 42 that registered, 42 that attended, representing over 40 zip codes in those overall registrants, covering both Prince William and Fairfax. So diverse group. For the point of the study that we were at, we were pleased with the turnout. We had a very good dialogue with the folks that participated in that public meeting. As we do with all of our public meetings, we did provide closed captioning. We also make language interpretation services available on that meeting on the 27th was interpreted in Spanish. Our meeting recording is available on our project website as well. So looking ahead to next week, back at the end of September, we shared some collateral and some information about these upcoming public meetings. Appreciate everyone's help in helping us get the word out to make those meetings very well attended and successful. We do have a few key objectives in the meetings next week. We want to summarize the findings of the study. We want to be able to show the impact of some of the land use assumptions and get some feedback on that and provide context on the next steps for future investment. So this is really at the meat of the study and where it's so critical to get that public feedback on what goes into the final report. Our consultant team did hold some pop-up events over the past few weeks to distribute flyers. They interacted with lots of folks at the Franconia Springfield Metro Station and in other locations in the study area to really help get the word out. So anything that you can do to help us get folks engaged and participating in these upcoming meetings, we would greatly appreciate. So now we're going to shift gears and start talking about the evaluation. I think this is what everybody really wants to see out of the study. And we can go to the next slide. I believe we showed you this slide back in June. We talked about how we would evaluate the feasibility of different options in terms of our goals. We shared many of these slides that you're about to see in the July public meeting as some early outcomes of our analysis. We have a lot more detail. We are scratching the surface today with you. So if you see anything that is of particular interest that you want to drill down into, we are happy to have one-on-one conversations and get into as much detail about any aspect of the study as would be helpful to any of you. So in terms of looking, we can go back just for a second. I wanted to touch on what we're going to touch on in the next couple of slides is ridership, but we've also looked at congestion mitigation, equity, regional connectivity, of course, cost effectiveness, and then that land use component and the development potential around station locations. Now we can go to the next one, Tom. Thank you. So I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about total transit boardings. And when we talk about a boarding, that is basically every time someone gets on a new transit vehicle. So if somebody gets on a local local bus to get to VRE or to get to the Metro Rail, each time they board a new vehicle, it's going to count as a boarding. So it's looking at each individual trip segment. In looking at those boardings, the BRT alternative does show us that it has the highest number of transit boardings in the study corridor. Having more stations and shorter trips, that isn't really surprising to me. But it does show that there's a propensity for that type of transit. When we look at the boardings, it's also important to mention that we do through this also see some shift between the different transit modes and different transit providers. So in some cases, you'll see somebody shift from maybe taking an express bus for their trip to now, in this modeling, taking the BRT or a Metro Rail line instead of the express bus. So this is looking at those overall trips and the mode or the type of service that they choose to use. Go on to the next one. So the next three slides, I want to show you some more detail about the BRT and Metro Rail alignments and alternatives that we looked at. And for these, each of the circles on that alignment represent a station location, and then each of the circles, the size of the circle, and then the darkness or the depth of the color of that circle is indicative of the number of daily boardings anticipated for that station location. So the larger the circle and the darker the color, the more anticipated daily boardings at that location. So for BRT, we see the highest ridership and the highest projected ridership on the northern end of the corridor. This is the same area of this BRT corridor that's part of the Richmond Highway BRT project that Fairfax County already has underway. But we see high ridership demand in Beacon Hill, Hybla Valley, and South County and Fairfax. We also see strong ridership at Potomac Mills. We do see lower ridership on the southern end of the corridor, particularly stations like Triangle and Dumfries. Go on to the next one. So shifting over to Metro Rail and looking at those alignments, we'll start with the blue line, same methodology in terms of those circles and station locations. For the blue line, we are seeing the strongest ridership at North Woodbridge and Fort Belvoir North area. And again, very similar to BRT, we're seeing low ridership south of Potomac Town Center, particularly, again, at Triangle at the end of that corridor. We can move on and look at the yellow line. Same methodology, again, with the circles. Strongest ridership in this corridor, again, is in the north, where the Richmond Highway BRT project is well on its way to development. But there's stations at Beacon Hill and Hybla Valley, but we also see a high demand at North Woodbridge. We do see some strong ridership at Thornton and through the Potomac Mills area at the Potomac Mills station. None of those locations get more than 2,000 riders a day, but most of the Prince William stations, which are the same, whether it's blue or yellow alternatives, do get more ridership in this yellow line alternative. Again, south of Potomac Mills, Potomac Town Center, on the southern end of the corridor, it's very low ridership. So the next thing we want to touch on is new transit trips, where we started off talking about boardings every time somebody gets onto a new mode or new vehicle. This graphic is going to represent the new transit trips in the study area. And it's going to look at those trips end to end as one trip, regardless of how many routes or services that they use along the way. The two different colors, the blue bars for each of the alternatives are capturing those trips that are from the study corridor. The red are capturing those trips that are going to the study corridor. So the yellow line alternative does create the most new transit trips to and from the study corridor compared to our baseline, but the BRT is more balanced with from and to, and also the Metro Rail blue line is a little bit more balanced than the yellow line. So this graphic is going to summarize the evaluation results for all five of those measures that were on that first gray table in the beginning for each of the different alternatives that we did look at. I haven't really talked about what's on the slide for additional VRE service, just to refresh everyone's memory. All of the improvements that are part of the Transforming Rail in Virginia improvement package are included in the baseline of the study. So where we say additional VRE service, that is small incremental changes above what is already committed in Transforming Rail in Virginia. So we haven't spent a lot of time on that. The impact of the Transforming Rail in Virginia program on growing commuter rail in the corridor is already captured in the baseline. So just wanted to call that out and specify why I wasn't speaking to that directly. We talked about the ridership potential already. Congestion mitigation generally follows a fairly similar path. I do want to spend a little more time talking about regional accessibility and equity. When you look out into the future, by 2045, the yellow line and the BRT alternatives have the most residents within a half a mile of those networks. The blue line has the most jobs within a half mile of that alignment and those station locations. The yellow line provides the biggest increase in accessibility to regional jobs by transit for residents within the study corridor. So, there's some trade-offs between the different alignments in terms of accessibility to where people live and accessibility to jobs. And it's definitely something that was interesting to me in looking at the study results. From an equity perspective, the BRT has more station locations just by nature of the type of transit service. And in looking at the socioeconomic data and the accessibility to those BRT stations, the residents near the BRT alternatives are more than 45% comprised of residents of equity emphasis areas. And, more likely in those areas we're serving more low-income or minority populations. The yellow line has the largest gain in new trips, which I pointed out on the last slide, but also the increase in job accessibility for residents of those equity emphasis areas. And then finally, I want to touch on cost effectiveness. Whenever you look at, and this is a broad range of different transit alternatives that we've considered as part of this study. And so when you look at cost effectiveness, adding additional express bus from a capital perspective is relatively inexpensive. So when you look at that as a cost per rider, the cost effectiveness of adding additional express bus is certainly the most cost effective option. BRT probably comes in a short. After that, there is obviously capital involved in stations and dedicated lanes associated with BRT, but it's not as intense as a metro rail extension would be in terms of overall capital cost to bring that online. BRT does tend to be 3 to 4 times more cost effective than a rail extension, so that gives the BRT 2 stars on the evaluation table. So that, we'll go ahead and we're going through a lot of stuff very quickly, and we can certainly go through anything in more detail. I want to talk a little bit about sensitivity because we have kind of kept things very consistent across these alternatives. So we wanted to go back and test a few different scenarios to see what would happen if we change some of our underlying assumptions. So the first one we're going to talk about is, I think for BRT and for both of the Metro Rail alternatives, I said, and the ridership falls off after Potomac Mills or Potomac Town Center as you head south towards Triangle. So the first question we wanted to ask is, can we make any of these alternatives or all of these alternatives more cost efficient by shortening the alignment? What does that do to ridership? We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, there's a lot of uncertainty in long-range planning now with the impacts of COVID, and the increased amount of telework. We wanted to look at some scenarios of what happens if more people continue to telework at a rate that was higher than what they were teleworking prior. And then I also want to talk about land use changes. That's that second parallel path of our study, looking at, what would a significant change in land use do in terms of ridership and cost effectiveness. So let's start with shortening the alignment. So we did test shorter versions of the blue line, yellow line, and BRT alternatives. As I mentioned a minute ago, south of basically the Potomac Town Center, we showed pretty low ridership and low cost efficiency on those alternatives. On to the next slide. So when we look at how the analysis kind of plays out with the shorter alignments, what is the impact? So generally speaking, when we shorten that corridor, the Metro rail ridership in terms of transit boardings is less impacted than BRT. And that's, again, it's just kind of the nature of the type of transit that we're providing. You see a lot of folks that get in a car and drive to a terminal station on Metro Rail, whether that's at Triangle or Potomac Mills. It doesn't really change the propensity to those trips quite as much. We do see with the shorter BRT a little bit of a drop-off in transit boardings, but it's very, very negligible. In terms of impact to new transit trips in the study corridor, we do see the number of new transit trips for BRT drop considerably by dropping the southern tail of that corridor. But the impact, again, on the two Metro Rail alternatives is relatively small. In terms of cost per rider, the cost per rider of taking off the southern extent of the BRT is pretty negligible there. But we do see an improvement in the cost per rider or the overall cost effectiveness of both Metro Rail alternatives by reducing the length of the corridor and terminating there at Potomac Town Center. So very helpful information as we look at feasibility. So next, we're going to shift and talk about telework. And for telework, I wanted to start off and talk a little bit about our baseline, like pre-COVID view of the world when it comes to telework. So if we look at 2019, about a third of the region's workers teleworked regularly or occasionally. So there was some telework already occurring in the corridor. That had increased quite a bit since 2007, and that was 19% in 2007. So you can see we've been on this trajectory for a while where, the incidence of telework as a traffic mitigation measure has definitely, seen an increase in telework over time. It's something that the Commonwealth has promoted as a congestion mitigation measure. But we did, with the onset of COVID-19, we did see a dramatic increase in telework. Some of the numbers out of the region estimated that 60 to 65% of regional workers were able to work at home. Many of them continue to work at home. So what does that mean, for us long term? What is kind of is there a range that we can look at to see, what would be the impact if there is if we continue to see this growth in telework over time? So for the sensitivity of our assumptions based on telework, we did look at a range. We looked at a low end, which would be an increase to 45% teleworking on average, a little over a day a week. The high end was 55% teleworking a day and a half a week. It does impact transit ridership. I think we've seen a lot of that over the course of the past 18 months. Metro Rail does tend to be impacted more significantly by a shift to more telework, simply because a higher percentage of the trips by Metro Rail are office-based work trips compared to BRT, which has, just by nature of the structure, serves more kind of local trips and non-work-based trips. So moving from telework to land use, and as a planner who has spent her career in transportation, I think it's fascinating to look at the land use side. And so to get to do this type of analysis as part of a transit or transportation study, to me is I will say it's fun and it's interesting, and it certainly helps add to the body of information that's available for elected officials and for decision makers looking at potential transit improvements in the corridor. So I want to start by just emphasizing that all of our initial model results and everything that we've presented thus far, we use the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments model. We use their cooperative land use forecast and their socioeconomic data for 2045. That way we're always working off of the regional, backbone of, land use and socioeconomic data. So for this assessment, what we've done is we've looked at a couple of different land use scenarios that are basically refocusing the growth and refocusing the population as transit-oriented development by increasing the densities around the station areas. One scenario we looked at Metro Rail, the other at BRT. So we'll start off in just the map on the screen. We looked at 8 station areas to do our analysis. We stayed that way. We covered the station areas where there's an overlap between the blue and yellow lines, and where and also with some of the BRT alignment. So we looked at Newington, Lorton, North Woodbridge, the landing at Prince William, Potomac Mills, Potomac Town Center, Southbridge, and Triangle. And in many cases, there's already small area planning, comprehensive plan special planning areas that are looking at these particular areas in a lot more detail. So it gives us, more information to lean into as we look at different options. We also have, some baseline terminology and design guidelines in the multimodal system design guidelines that the Commonwealth has in place. These design guidelines were developed by DRPT and VDOT initially back in 2012, 2013. They were used in the Richmond Highway BRT project analysis early on. We gave these guidelines a refresh in 2020, and so this is our first opportunity to really use them on a big study like this. So for those, we just have some different types of land use, the associated density, and that gives us something to lean into in terms of describing what these place types look like and what the density looks like. So we've based our analysis on this. So this next map, and this this one we're sharing is for the Metro Rail scenario. You'll see basically those nodes of activity around those station locations, where you'll see they kind of blend together there in the Woodbridge, Potomac Mills area. Where you see the blue, and these circles are representing a mile around the station areas. Where you see the blue, those are the areas of the lowest density, and then the orange, the darker, deeper orange color, is where you would see the highest density, or our place type 4.5. Those orange colors, and why I want to call them out on the map when we look at density, is those are those are the areas where we're seeing the capability for density that falls in line with Metro's guidelines around station development and land use density. Metro does have a set of land use guidelines that were developed in 2015. That would be after Silverline, but that's something that Metro has out there as a rule of thumb. So I just want to point that out graphically to show you what kind of assumptions that we've been able to make as part of this analysis. So what does that do by station location, and what does the scenario look like? Well, as you can see, and I won't walk through each one of these numbers, but we do see in pumping up that density in those station locations, we see significant increases in population, significant increases in jobs. Sometimes it's both, depending on the station location and the types of land use in those areas and in kind of envisioned in those corridors. As we have done this analysis, I think it's important to point out that we stay within the control totals for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments 2045 land use and socioeconomic data. So this is not adding to the overall regional population. It's not adding to the overall population that is contemplated in those documents for Prince William County or for Fairfax County. It is reallocating those estimates around these transit nodes. And so in the case of Prince William, just want to point out that this basically means that all of the development and the population growth and the job growth in Prince William ends up occurring around these transit nodes, but based on the projections that are in those current COG documents. So what does that mean for ridership? Because that's what everybody wants to know, is what does it do? And I think it is, it is very clear that increasing the density around those station locations is going to increase ridership, and it is, it's a significant bump in ridership when you see that land use density, population, job balance shifting closer to those station locations. I also want to make sure that I point out, we have worked very closely with the staff in Fairfax County and in Prince William County. We're very grateful for their partnership in working through all of this. Land use studies aren't what we usually get to work on, and so we are very grateful that we've been able to work in such great partnership with them. In our conversations with Fairfax County, we did identify some things around the Newington station location in terms of land use that were problematic. So we do need to go back and do some adjustments there that will bring those numbers for the Blue Line alternative down some when we make those changes. I also think it's still important to point out that even with this increase in ridership, the overall cost effectiveness, Metro Rail extensions are expensive. And when you look at that on a cost per rider basis, that it is better in this land use scenario, but it is still a significant cost per rider. The last thing I want to mention on this slide is that we did this analysis based on the full length of those original alternatives for the Blue Line, the Yellow Line, and the BRT. We do need to go back and since we did the sensitivity analysis and we looked at shortening those routes, we also need to look at the impact of shortening those routes related to the land use. Probably not overall significant, but I do think it's worth pointing out that this analysis was based on those original longer corridors. Go on to the next slide, Tom. So I want to just kind of close out this land use discussion and mention some of the best practices and some of what is state of the practice with transit-oriented development and achieving the kind of land use changes that are contemplated in this particular analysis, which is a significant magnitude, requires a lot of supporting elements, a lot of other changes beyond transportation. So that's, looking at zoning and station area planning and, comp plans and things with the local governments. But it's also got a transportation component because changing the density of those areas, you need to think about transportation completely differently. And it's a much more human level transportation that is multimodal in nature, and looking at things like walkability, the ped bike network, how other local transit feeds into those locations, micromobility with scooters and bike share. I mean, it really does start to change the transportation discussions completely in those areas. Fairfax County has a lot of experience with that. I mentioned two examples momentarily, but it is a much bigger, broader discussion to make that kind of transit-oriented development a reality. So we can go to the next slide and highlight, just to give you a couple of examples of what kind of density does that look like, and some great case studies that we'll include in our final reporting. I mean, Fairfax County has a tremendous amount of experience with this already, with Tyson's related to the Silver Line, and Dunloring Metro Station and the Mosaic District. Great examples of where this has been put into place. But on the slide, you'll also see an example from the White Flint area in Montgomery County, and also one from Massachusetts. So it gives you a glimpse at what that kind of transit-oriented development looks like. So other considerations, and there's a lot of information here, but there's a few more considerations, and these are things that we're continuing to put a fine point on, and we'll bring you when we have another briefing next month. But obviously, a Metro Rail extension like what we're contemplating in this study would be a significant addition to the Metro system. The graphic on the right-hand side will show you, a change. If we looked at all the way to Triangle, I mean, we're 22 to 29 miles, depending on which alternative. That's significant. Anytime you talk about a change to the Metro Rail system, the conversation around core capacity and what happens when all those routes come together in the core of DC is obviously a part of conversation, and those needs have to be addressed first. Otherwise, we're just adding to the challenges. Along the same lines, any addition that would increase congestion in Roslyn Tunnel is something else that would have to be addressed, before a Metro Rail extension would be viable. There also, WMATA is a complex intergovernmental compact, so there are legal and governance implications related to adding Prince William County as a compact jurisdiction. We do have on our consultant team counsel that's helping to outline what that process would look like, and then along with that, beyond the capital cost, the upfront capital cost of constructing an extension, there is also the annual capital and operating budget subsidy contributions that would need to come from Prince William County to support not only an extension, but to support as a partner the Metro Rail system as a whole. So a few other considerations that we're working on as part of the final report. Go on. So we will walk through next steps really quickly. Again, we've got the public meetings next week, September 21st and 23rd. I want to emphasize that both of those meetings, the content is the same. We simply wanted to provide two alternative dates to expand our reach and understand everybody has busy schedules, and wanted to make sure that we had two options available. Those meetings will each start at 7 p.m. We are on track to complete our draft report in early October, and in doing so, we are anticipating another elected officials briefing for you in early October as well, looking at the week of October 11th, but we will circle back with you shortly with another save the date. That will be kind of the conclusion of these loose ends that I've mentioned today that we're still working on. And again, our final report is due to be submitted to the General Assembly by December 1st. And with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'd love to, on behalf of the study team, happy to take any questions.
Jennifer, this is Scott Sorabell. I got 5 questions.
Go ahead.
And first of all, I want to thank you all for the information and the briefing. You all have obviously put a lot of work into this, and there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there for people to digest. And back at the beginning, one of the first questions I had was, it looks to me like when you all evaluated potential blue line, yellow line routes, you looked at two routes. And I remember, I think early in the discussion, there was one discussion of running the blue line over towards the what we used to be called the Fort Belvoir Engineering Proving Ground, which I guess is now called the Fort Belvoir North area, where the Geospatial Intelligence Facility is, where 9,000 people work right now today and commute by car. And the Capital Planning Commission is looking at exactly how much further long-term workers or jobs they're going to have in there. I think they're looking at moving the Defense Intelligence Agency in there. Anyway, my point is, did y'all look at alternate blue line alignments or just the one alignment? Because and secondary to that, did you all look at a combination of extensions? So, for example, a yellow line extension to Woodbridge and taking the blue down to the NGA and stopping it there or something, just getting a 1 or 2 stop extension off Franconia Springfield. Did you look at combinations of possibilities or just either or?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, given the schedule and what we had to accomplish quickly, we did screen out some of the alignments. So I think there definitely are variations on these alignments that could be a future next step. But for our purposes, we really were just trying to provide what we thought was a reasonable alignment to get that comparison between trade-off between different metro options and BRT. And from these initial results, certainly we're learning more that could help inform maybe potential tweaks to alignments that you might want to look at in the future.
Okay. Second question of the 5. You all talked about cost effectiveness, and I didn't see any costs anywhere, number one. So I was just curious if you all came up, if you're going to put any cost numbers out there, because the sticker shock hit some people on what Metro put out last week. So number one, I was curious about that. And secondly, when you talked about cost effectiveness, one of the advantages of heavy transit versus other possibilities are carbon impacts, right? Which I think we need to be thinking about a lot in the future in terms of minimizing carbon. And I'm just not. Is that at all? So 2 sub questions on that. One is, did you get some cost estimates on this? And the second question is, when you talk about cost effectiveness, do you all look at sort of environmental benefit of people living in more dense environments, using less energy to get around, and in general using less energy to move and that kind of stuff, or is that just too out there and hard to figure out right now?
Yeah, so starting with the cost estimates, Tom and the team are we're definitely going to have cost estimates in the final report, and we will share those at the next elected officials briefing. I think we want to make sure that we're comfortable with those cost estimates before they hit a slide, because once they're on a slide in an elected officials briefing or in a document, we will live with them forever. And so I think, especially in light of what Metro released last week, we want to make sure that we're completely comfortable with those numbers before we share them, but we will have them in the report. With the greenhouse gas and decarbonization, we have not done specific analysis for this particular study for that. Transit, generally speaking, is more environmentally friendly than other transportation modes. There is some other work that we're working on in the I-95 corridor with VDOT, looking at the corridor from a broader perspective related to greenhouse gases and decarbonization. I think that can be coupled with this study in the future. But Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't specifically look at that as part of our scope for this.
Correct. We do have that congestion mitigation goal area, and the measure for that is really VMT, which is a good way to track what we're doing in terms of GHG impacts.
I got it. It's just, I think that one of the selling points of transit is that net for society, reduced health costs and less carbon emissions and a whole bunch of other things. It's healthier lifestyle, whatever. There's a lot of different reasons why it might look more expensive in terms of the check you write, but society saves a lot of money more long term. But that's, I guess, kind of hard for you guys to quantify. Third question on the land use stuff. You looked at those land use areas that require major land use changes, and I noticed you did not look at anything on the yellow line between Fort Belvoir and Hybla Valley. And I remember when we looked at this in between 2011 and 15, one of the reasons that a yellow line extension was ruled out was because it would require massive land use changes in that corridor, and there was a thought that maybe we just didn't want to talk about that. And I noticed it wasn't even brought up. I think you guys just assumed, I guess, the population to justify this, the ridership to justify this, would come from Belvoir and below, as opposed to from Woodlawn and sort of southern Hybla Valley or whatever. I mean, was there a reason you guys didn't look at any land use changes in that area, sort of where we're currently doing the 2.5 mile widening?
Jen, this is Tim. I can answer if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Okay, yeah. So that's an excellent point, Senator Sorrell. Obviously that was part of the DRPT study for the Richmond Highway. Fairfax County's done so much work in that section, and Fairfax County they do have TOD plans and plans for neighborhood centers in that area between Fort Belvoir and Hybla Valley. That when the consultant team kind of sat down with them to look at potential stations and areas where they could add, to the work that the county's done, they didn't see anything they could add to what the county's done. So that's kind of why the TOD was focused on those 8 stations. There was an area of process with both of the counties, the transportation and the planning and land use steps.
Okay. 4th question. Land use on the Lorton/Newington area. I heard you guys say that there was some issues or whatever, which I'm curious about. But in the multimodal study, we also recommended that phase 3 of the multimodal study was to extend BRT down Route 1 through Lorton to the Woodbridge VRE. And part of that required land use changes so that we had more transit-oriented development sort of in that Lorton area along Route 1 to support a bus rapid transit. And the county has not yet implemented that phase 3 land use recommendations or whatever. They haven't even started the process of that. And I was curious, in terms of your assumptions, whether you had assumed the additional changes that the Route 1 BRT is supposed to, the land use changes that are supposed to be done to support the Route 1 BRT that haven't been started yet. And I was curious whether your recommendations square with what we looked at, the recommendations of the Route 1 multimodal study 5 years ago, because there was already a lot of work done and all there.
Tim, do you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's candidly, Senator Sorrell, it is kind of a similar answer. We showed the county staff the alignments, and we asked for their input, and we asked for sort of more current information on land uses. And there was some areas where the county staff were kind of matter of fact about they didn't want more development or they didn't want different types of development. So a lot of areas that are currently light industrial or just wilderness, undeveloped land right now, the county said that their intent was to keep that land use the same. So you do get a benefit around Lorton. You get a lot more development in Lorton. There's already a transit station there. If there's a metro station, you get more. And then you get a lot of development in that area between Woodbridge and Potomac Mills and Potomac Town Center. Those are the areas where you really, really get a lot of greater densities and a lot more benefit from land use when a high capacity transit comes through.
Okay. Last question. When we did the multimodal study, one of the things that came out of that at the end was you all made some, or DRPT, whoever it was, the contractor, made some phasing recommendations and said, if you want to get the densities to support a yellow line extension, do this first, do this second, start building the land use. Are you guys going to make any sort of recommendations about phasing in terms of, in order to get these things done, so this is the best way to do it, if you, or, time frames, anything like that, or you just...
No, Senator Sorrell, no. In this study, we're not going to make those kinds of recommendations. This is really a first cut at feasibility, and provide that information to the elected officials to provide further direction on which way you want to go.
Right.
It's such a wide range of alternatives. I think, certainly if the region settles in on a preferred preferred corridor, preferred alternative, that's when you get into the finer point on phasing and different alignments and termination points.
Got it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Watts.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the excellent briefing. I only have two questions. The two questions, both, however, I think I'll relate to phasing. The first one, will you, in the draft report, because I have the same concern that you have about dollars once they're down, having to live with them, I want to make sure that the draft report is clear on addressing this issue. The capacity of Ballston as far as the blue line is concerned versus the capacity on the yellow line, so that even though the alternative is a 66% increase in ridership for the blue line and the yellow is only 32, that issue has to be in the draft from the get-go as far as a systemic thing that must be dealt with. I'm seeing nods. I assume that is then registered and that will be part of the draft report as well as the final report.
Yes, ma'am. And we hit that last slide of content, and Tom, please feel free to jump in. But that last contact slide, there was a lot on there in terms of loose ends that we have left to tie up for the draft report. And that issue of core capacity in Ballston, Roslyn is definitely something that impacts the viability of a blue line extension versus a yellow line extension. So Tom, feel free to jump in, but I do think that's something that we need to address.
Yeah. Now, just to reiterate, Metro staff are on our technical advisory committee, and they've made that point throughout the study about core capacity being a priority.
Thank you. And then the second question is a spin-off from work that was done with Senator Barker more than a few years ago on BRT. That one of the advantages of BRT is that it could be phasing for fixed rail. When you're looking at BRT in this study, are you making that assumption that these various densities and where these stations are in fact also future metro sites potentially?
Tom, do you want to take that one? Or Tim?
Yeah. I think as we've mentioned, at least in our assumptions, the stations align pretty well. The BRT has a few, just given the nature of BRT, the stop spacing is closer together. So we had more stations in the BRT option than Metro, but all of the places selected for Metro stations would have that BRT accessibility, if that makes sense.
It does, and just one follow-up on that, though, as the BRT station potentially is identified and developed, the local land use decisions, the local board of supervisors decisions about the size of that station is something that I hope will be clearly identified if we are to make the kind of evolution phasing to possible fixed rail.
Yes, Delegate Watts, that would certainly be something that would need to be, we can reference that in this study, but that would be something that would come in a subsequent analysis or a more detailed development of a preferred corridor.
Thank you.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Delegate Watts. Supervisor Bailey, you have your hand up. And if anybody else, if you have a question, feel free to click the raise hand and we'll make sure that we get to you and answer your question. So Supervisor Bailey, did you have a question?
I do, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. And I think it's just a kind of a follow-up. I have two, but somewhat of a follow-up to Delegate Watts and Senator Searville. I just wanted to, if you could, just briefly explain when we are making these land use decisions, how do we coordinate or provide that information to your organization to make sure that we're updating you? I mean, I know that it's just if you could just give me briefly how that's done, that would help. And then my second question is just for clarity. I'll ask that after you answer.
So our organization, so DRPT is not involved in local land use decision making. But obviously, anything that the local government changes in terms of station area planning, comprehensive planning, zoning land use affects the subsequent transportation studies that come after it. So I do think that, we want to be part of a continuing dialogue, and to the extent that we can support those evaluations that the county is making going forward, we're happy to do that.
Okay. And then thank you for that. And then my next question is just for clarity. I noticed on your slide the designation for the was Southbridge and Triangle, and I'm assuming that that the association is for Potomac Shores, where the VRE is going to be built, and Quantico as it relates to Triangle. Is that assumption right?
Tom, can you take that one? Just want to make sure that.
Yeah, that's correct. The Southbridge station would be closest to Potomac Shores, and then Triangle, like you said, is close to the gate for Quantico, and so we're assuming, you would have to have in the case of Quantico, a shuttle connection sort of into the base from there for some of the rail options.
But when you make it, well, this is a second level question. So when you make your presentation, will you use that terminology, Southbridge and Triangle, or will you use those designated rail areas?
Yeah, the station names that we have in there, are really for reference, and we can certainly be sure to indicate some of the activities that are around those station areas, just so that's clear to people.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. I'm just saying in terms of the public meeting and helping the community to understand. So thank you, and thank you for the great presentation. We appreciate your work.
Yeah, thank you, Supervisor Bailey. We can make notes of that in the final report. Those are good comments, so thank you.
Thank you.
So next up is Chair Wheeler. Chair Wheeler, did you have a question?
Yeah, real quick. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask about the numbers that you might come up with regard to cost per jurisdiction. And I'll just be blunt in saying that when we looked at the VRE extension, they attached numbers to it of, $320 million for the extension of the VRE to Gainesville, when we know that we probably wouldn't have absorbed all those costs. It might have been other ways to absorb those costs throughout, and not necessarily only falling on our jurisdiction. And I worry that the numbers, I just want to sort of understand the numbers you might come up with regards to cost of jurisdiction, as well as I know that, and I don't have a detailed familiarity about the compact about how everybody pays, but I do know that, like right now, it might be based on, instead of ridership, population, and that lends itself to different imbalances in how it would, and so are those same things going to continue forward? If it's based on population, we have a problem with that. So I also worry about the numbers you might throw out initially. People might look at and just say no. So do you have any idea like how you might couch those or look at them?
So, and the numbers, it is a complicated conversation, because once you put a number out there, it's out there forever. And so we are very cognizant of that. In terms of construction costs and capital costs to extend Metro Rail into Prince William, I would say we're probably going to give you a range. And it's those types of projects typically don't have a funding split by jurisdiction. They have a pretty complex financial plan. So we can provide some information to support that range of costs with maybe some information on how those types of projects are typically funded. I do think that we are working with Metro and others to try to come up with an estimate of those ongoing capital and operating subsidies that would be anticipated should Prince William County join the compact. I think you raise why they're not the easiest things to figure out. So we are working on that as well. And I think in all fairness, I think we'll present those as a range as well, just because they are not always the easiest to put a fine point on. Tom, Tom and Tim, feel free to jump in, but I feel like that's where we're headed.
Yeah, no, this is Tim. Jen, I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, there's a part of the study that looks at the relationship with NVTC. The NVTC is sort of where the costs are allocated, within Virginia. And as you pointed out, Wheeler, I mean, it is a complicated formula. It changes based on things like population, like ridership. It changes based on, every 2 or 3 years, because they're surveying ridership. There's a different formula for bus and rail. So, but it is something at a very high level that would be included in the study.
Thank you. And Supervisor Bodie, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, I had a couple. Wanted to echo some of my colleagues and say we really appreciate the time, as always, the work that you've been putting into this. We know that, relatively speaking, for the scope that this is doing, you guys have done a lot of work in a relatively short period of time. So before I went to my question, I want to say that it's not lost on most of us. So I appreciate your hard work. My questions, if I can be very brief with them, is one, is as you guys are sort of finalizing your work and looking at these different scenarios, are you looking at existing infrastructure that can be sort of synergized into these stations, whether it's BRT or especially Metro? Because, in Prince William, we have a lot of existing, commuter lots and park and rides that are large scale because we're used to having large amounts of people park, get on, our normal Omni ride buses, or back when slugging was a thing before COVID, slugging and sort of using that. So are you guys also looking at the feasibility and even the cost in terms of investment into using and synergizing existing infrastructure into those?
At the level that we are able to get with this study, we are not looking at those specific elements. I think that's a very valid point that there, as this effort goes forward and as specific corridors maybe are focused on, I think that is a very good point and something that would have to be looked at in future study. Sure,
I appreciate that. And my second and just sort of final question has to do with sort of the phasing that some of our colleagues mentioned earlier. When we look at especially the parts of this that are in my district, you have both the landing at Prince William, but also Potomac Mills. Those are sort of pretty different areas, but they share the commonality in that they have large scale existing shopping centers that we would imagine, and I know you guys have sort of been factoring into this and sort of the land use conversation, massive amount of development, because a lot of these things don't happen in vacuums, and we know that. As soon as we even put plans on a map that we want and we're interested in, that we'd be willing to fund, a metro station or even just a BRT, the market shifts and people have a lot of interest. So I guess my question, where I'm going with this, is in your projections and how you guys are looking at the land use, you mentioned that you're sort of looking at if we shifted a lot of our development in these areas, is that also looking at the fact that we have large existing shopping centers that would then probably be redeveloped more into town centers and those walkable communities that you guys have been talking about?
We did have some of those conversations with the county staff, but again, the level of detail that we were able to get into in this particular study, we didn't get into specific parcels, but we did have those conversations with your county staff. Sure. So I think it's a very, very good point.
Yeah, and so then just similar to what Supervisor Bailey was talking about earlier, I would imagine that even though we're not going to be necessarily giving you guys updated information after the study is concluded, I would imagine that as we start to have those subsequent conversations, it could still have our planning staff interface with you all to make sure that, the guidance that you're giving us on that direction is sort of hand in glove, that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, we have resources based in Northern Virginia for that very reason, and so we would be happy to continue the dialogue as you contemplate, future changes or planning efforts or implementation efforts in the corridor. Happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
And that, I do not see any other raised hands on the control panel. So we'll wrap up. I will extend the offer that we've made previously. If any of you have an interest in diving into this in any more detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would be happy to have one-on-ones, now or after the study is wrapped up. At any point, we are here and available to do that with you. I will also send out a follow-up email this afternoon with the information about next week's public meetings again. So that'll have the information on how you can log into those meetings. And I would simply ask, and we'll share all of the social media information. So as you send out newsletters to your constituents or use your social media, if you would help us get the word out by sharing that, we would greatly appreciate it. Again, thank you so much for your time.